It was generally agreed in the village of Little Pafley that nothing of consequence ever happened on a Tuesday. Weddings were reserved for Saturdays, funerals for Wednesdays when the vicar was at his most resonant, and scandal, by long tradition, preferred Fridays when there was the weekend ahead in which to discuss it. Tuesdays were for the laundry, the small and disappointing fete committee, and the quiet despair of those who had ordered meat from Peabody's and regretted it. That the body of Mr. Ambrose Clutterbuck should be found in the old library on a Tuesday morning was, therefore, felt by many to be in distinctly poor taste. The old library stood at the northern end of the village green, a flint and brick building that had once been a dower house and had, through a series of bequests, misunderstandings, and one ill-advised vote at a parish meeting in 1889, become the private library of the Clutterbuck family. Ambrose, the last of his line, had the habit of reading there every morning from 9 until 11, punctuated by a cup of coffee brought by Mrs. Halloway, who had cleaned for him since the war and regarded his preferences with the tolerant contempt usually reserved for damp weather. On this particular Tuesday she had knocked at 9:20, as she always did, and received no answer. This, in itself, was not remarkable. Mr. Clutterbuck had been known, when engrossed in Trollope, to ignore earthquakes. She had knocked a second time, then a third, and at last, with the exasperated sigh of a woman who had better things to do and had been doing them for 31 years, she had used her key. The door opened perhaps 3 inches before stopping. Something, she discovered upon peering in, was behind it. That something was Mr. Clutterbuck. He was lying on his back on the carpet, one hand flung out as though reaching for a book he had never meant to drop, and he was, beyond any possibility of doubt or missus Halloway's limited medical knowledge, dead. There was a small, neat wound above his left ear, and a brass letter opener of the sort sold at charity bazaars to people who did not really want them lay not far from his right elbow. Mrs. Halloway, being a woman of method, shut the door again, walked to the telephone in the hall, and rang the police. Then she rang the vicar, because one ought to, and then her sister in Tring, because one wanted to. Constable Pinfold arrived on his bicycle at 20 to 10, Inspector Morley from Market Deeping at 1/4 past, and by 11 o'clock the village had taken the news fully on board, and was preparing to be appalled at its leisure. The difficulty, as Inspector Morley was shortly to discover, was not so much who had done it as how. The old library, you see, had precisely one door. This had been Ambrose Clutterbuck's great-grandfather's notion of security, and though subsequent generations had grumbled about fire regulations, no one had ever quite got round to altering it. There were 3 windows, all tall and narrow, all fitted with wrought-iron grills on the outside, a deterrent against the kind of local boys who, in 1894, had been considered a menace to civilization. The grills were still there, and still intact. The windows behind them had been latched from within. The single door had been locked from the inside. The key was in Mr. Clutterbuck's waistcoat pocket. Mrs. Halloway's key had opened the door, but only after pressing against the late owner's shoulder blades. No one had been seen to enter the building. No one had been seen to leave it. Inspector Morley, a man who preferred crimes that obliged him by being straightforward, stood in the middle of the carpet and considered the matter with the expression of someone who has ordered soup and been brought a goldfish. "Well," he said, at last, to Constable Pinfold, "I shall have to telephone." "Sir?" "London. They keep a gentleman there for this sort of thing." "Do they, sir?" "They do. Enormous fellow, reads a great deal, drinks beer in public houses, and expects other people to find this charming." He sighed. "I cannot say I share the enthusiasm, but he has, I am told, a certain way with the impossible." And so it was that at 4:20 on the afternoon of that deeply improper Tuesday, the 4:15 from Liverpool Street disgorged upon the platform at Market Deeping, a gentleman of quite extraordinary dimensions, who wore a shovel hat, leaned upon 2 canes, and was wheezing with the exertion of having walked 7 yards. Dr. Gideon Fell surveyed the station, the wet roof of the station master's cottage, and the sky, which was considering rain and had not yet committed itself. He smiled with every evidence of satisfaction. "Admirable," he said. "I feel certain it will be absurd." Inspector Morley, meeting him, was not sure whether this was a good omen or a bad one, and decided, for the sake of his dignity, not to inquire. They drove to Little Pafley in the inspector's motor, Dr. Fell occupying the greater part of it and apologizing for the fact at intervals. He asked, as they passed the first of the hedgerows, what sort of man Mr. Clutterbuck had been. "A quiet gentleman by all accounts," said Morley. "Bachelor, fond of books, no enemies that anyone can name." "Ah," said Dr. Fell, with great contentment. "Then he was murdered by a friend. That is always the more interesting case." The inspector glanced at him sideways and said nothing. A fine rain had begun on the windscreen, punctual as a housekeeper, and the village, when they came to it at last, looked as innocent as villages generally do when they have something to hide. At the gate of the old library, Mrs. Halloway was waiting with the air of a woman who had already told her story 3 times and would, if pressed, tell it a 4th, but would charge for it. Dr. Fell raised his hat to her. "Madam," he said, "I understand you found him." "I did, sir. And the door, I am told, was locked." "It was, sir, from the inside." "And the windows barred?" "They've been barred since before I was born, sir." Dr. Fell nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had long suspected about the universe. Then he turned to the inspector and beamed. "My dear Morley," he said, "this is going to be perfectly splendid. Somebody has gone to a great deal of trouble to make certain we shall disbelieve the evidence of our own eyes. Shall we go in?" And, with the small, apologetic grunt of a large man bending, he ducked under the low lintel of the old library and was gone. The old library smelled, as such rooms always do, of leather and slow decay, with a faint undercurrent of pipe tobacco that had not been disturbed for some hours. Dr. Fell took 3 wheezing steps inside and stopped, not because he had seen anything in particular, but because stopping was, in general, what he did best. Mr. Clutterbuck had been moved. Of course, decency required it, and now lay beneath a sheet in the adjoining morning room, awaiting the attentions of a police surgeon who was, at that moment, finishing his lunch at the George and Dragon and resenting the interruption. In the library itself, a chalk outline of admirable neatness marked where the body had lain, precisely behind the door, as Mrs. Halloway had described. "You observe, Doctor," said Inspector Morley, with the air of a man conducting a guided tour of his own misfortune, "the position." He fell, or was struck, with his back more or less to the door. The letter opener was there. He indicated a spot near the chalk elbow. The key to the door in his waistcoat pocket. "The windows, as you see." "Yes," said Dr. Fell, "I do see them. Remarkable pieces of ironmongery. One would think the Clutterbucks had been expecting Cromwell." He moved, with the slow deliberation of a cathedral being relocated, toward the nearest window, and peered out through the bars. The garden beyond was damp, rectangular, and dispiriting. A gravel path ran beneath each window. A single set of flower beds, lately dug over, bordered them. No footprint disturbed the gravel. No branch overhung the wall. "And nobody was seen?" he asked. "Nobody, sir. The postman passed at 9. The baker's boy at 20 past. Miss Leonie Trout, who lives opposite, was at her front window between 8:30 and 10:30, because she always is, and she observed no one approach the library, no one leave it, and no one loiter on the green." Morley paused. "Miss Trout is, I should add, of the opinion that the postman was walking too quickly, but I do not think that is relevant." "One never knows," said Dr. Fell cheerfully. "Go on." The door was locked when Mrs. Halloway arrived. She heard no sound. When she at length admitted herself, the body was behind the door. There was no one else in the room. There is no cellar, no attic, no connecting passage. The chimney is blocked, and has been since the late Mr. Clutterbuck's father put a jackdaw's nest in it by way of experiment in 1922. The floorboards are sound. The walls are flint and 18 inches thick. Dr. Fell listened to this recital with every appearance of delight, nodding at intervals as though each impossibility were a personal favor. When it was finished, he tapped the end of one cane upon the carpet. And the time of death? Between 8 and 10, the surgeon thinks. He'll be more precise after he's examined him. Then Mr. Clutterbuck was killed during the very hours Miss Trout was at her window. So it appears, sir. Admirable woman. One ought to send her flowers. Dr. Fell revolved slowly upon his canes and surveyed the room. Tell me, Inspector, the door was forced by Mrs. Halloway's shoulder against the weight of the body. By her weight against the door. The body was not pressed to it, only lying behind it, perhaps 6 inches clear. She felt the obstruction and stopped at once. And the key in his waistcoat, was it the key to this door? Morley hesitated. It fits this door, sir. Whether it is the key, well, it is the one he habitually carried. Ah. Dr. Fell's eyes, small and bright behind his pince-nez, lingered for a moment upon the chalk outline. How many keys to this room exist? 2, we're told. His and Mrs. Halloway's. Hers was in her apron. And any former keys? Cooks, gardeners, brothers, old tutors, forgotten cousins? The family solicitor, Mr. Pring, believes there was once a third, belonging to Mr. Clutterbuck's late father. It has not been seen since 1957. A missing key of nearly 70 years standing. Dr. Fell looked pleased. That is precisely the sort of key one should not trust. He crossed, with effort, to the great mahogany desk at which Mr. Clutterbuck had evidently been working. A book lay open upon it, face down, its spine protesting. A cup of coffee, half drunk and entirely cold, stood at the corner on a cork mat. The chair was drawn a little away, as though its occupant had risen casually, not in alarm, not in haste, but in the ordinary motion of a man fetching something he required. He got up, murmured Dr. Fell, voluntarily. He walked toward the door, and at or about the door, he was struck. By someone inside the room with him? By someone, Inspector. Let us leave the adverb of place for the moment. He bent, with what was plainly an architectural enterprise, to examine the carpet near the chalk head. The pile was thick, the pattern Turkish, the dust upon it undisturbed except where the body had lain. No drag marks, no scuffle. A single dark stain already drying. One blow, said Dr. Fell, straightening, delivered from in front and slightly above. He saw who struck him, Inspector, and he did not, I think, expect it. Then the letter opener is very possibly what killed him, yes. It is also, I should say, precisely the sort of object one notices upon a desk and picks up for reasons one cannot afterwards explain. It is convenient. It is to hand. It is a weapon only by accident. He turned the article gently over with the tip of his cane. A small charity bazaar tag still clung to its handle. Street Dunstan's 1,971, threepence, a bargain at the price. Outside, the rain had at last made up its mind and was falling in earnest upon the village green. Somewhere a dog barked once and thought better of it. Dr. Fell straightened to his full and considerable height, tucked his cloak about him, and beamed upon the inspector like a benevolent thunderstorm. "Morley, my dear fellow," he said, "a man has been killed inside a locked room that no one entered and no one left, by an instrument he purchased himself for threepence, in full view of a lady who sees everything and misses nothing. We are, I believe, about to be told a great many lies. Shall we begin with the vicar?" The vicarage stood at the southern end of the green, separated from the old library by 200 yards of wet grass, a war memorial, and the considered opinion of Miss Leonie Trout, who was watching them from her parlour window as they crossed. Dr. Fell raised his hat to her, receiving in reply a small dignified inclination that suggested she had already compiled a mental inventory of his waistcoat buttons. The Reverend Hugo Melinda opened his own door, which was, in Little Pafley, a mark of either humility or an absent housekeeper. He was a lean man of perhaps 55, with the sort of face that suggested a great deal of theology had passed through it without leaving any particular impression, and he greeted them with a cough, a small, dry, apologetic cough, delivered into his handkerchief. "Inspector, and Dr. Fell, is it? I have heard. Do come in. Frightful business, frightful." He conducted them to a study smelling faintly of beeswax and regret, and indicated 2 chairs of the kind that have been upholstered by parishioners rather than professionals. Dr. Fell lowered himself into one with the caution of a man testing ice, and the chair, after a moment's reflection, consented to hold him. "You were acquainted with Mr. Clutterbuck, Vicar?" "Oh, indeed, indeed, yes, a regular attender, back pew, north aisle. Preferred the 8 o'clock service, as those of a scholarly disposition often do." The vicar coughed again. "Forgive me. A touch of the throat. It comes and goes." "Since when?" asked Dr. Fell, pleasantly. The vicar blinked. "Since Monday evening, perhaps. Tuesday morning. One does not always mark these things." "No, indeed. And you called upon Mr. Clutterbuck when? Last?" "Yesterday afternoon, around 3. A matter of parish business, the Restoration Fund. He was a contributor, you understand, a generous one, within his means, which were comfortable, I believe, not lavish. The Clutterbucks were never lavish." A pause, a cough. One admired the restraint. Dr. Fell nodded and permitted a small silence to accumulate, of the sort into which nervous men are inclined to drop things. The vicar, however, did not drop anything. He merely folded his handkerchief with great care and waited. "Tell me, Vicar, had he seemed to you, of late, troubled?" "Troubled. Well." The vicar considered the word as though it had been offered to him on a collection plate, and he was uncertain of its denomination. He had been, I should say, preoccupied, since, perhaps, the middle of last month. One put it down to his reading. He had been engaged upon the cataloguing of his uncle's papers. His uncle being the late Colonel Edgar Clutterbuck, died in 1968, a soldier of a certain type. Ambrose had been meaning to sort the papers for years, and had only lately begun, and found, one supposes, something of interest. I could not say. The cough, this time, seemed a little drier. He did not confide in me in that respect. "Ah," Dr. Fell's pince-nez glittered mildly. "But in others he did?" The vicar permitted himself the smallest of smiles. "A vicar is confided in, Doctor, rather as a coat-stand is leaned upon. One does not always know what has been hung upon one, or by whom." "Admirable image. I shall remember it." Dr. Fell shifted his weight, and the chair made a small protest of principle. "May I ask where you were this morning between 8 and 10? "At Matins, Doctor. 8 until 20 past. Thereafter in the vestry with Mrs. Pring, sorting hymn books, until nearly 9:30. From 9:30 I was in this room, preparing Sunday's address. My housekeeper, Mrs. Betteridge, brought me coffee at 9:45. "Witnesses throughout, then?" "Throughout, Doctor. I am, in this village, very seldom alone." Dr. Fell smiled, as though at a private joke, and allowed the subject to drift. He inquired, idly, after the Restoration Fund. The vicar spoke of the South Transept, of damp, of an estimate from a firm in Cambridge that had made him wince. He inquired after the choir. The vicar spoke of the choir with the weariness of one who had long since given up hoping for tenors. He inquired at last after Mr. Clutterbuck's household, Mrs. Halloway. "Any regular visitors, any recent callers?" "Mrs. Halloway you have met," said the vicar. "A good woman, plain-spoken, regular visitors, very few. His solicitor, Mr. Pring, once a month. A Miss Vane, from Ely, who shared his interest in ecclesiastical bindings, and, latterly, a nephew. Dennis Clutterbuck, a young man of, how shall one put it, uneven prospects. He had come down from London, perhaps 3 times in the last 6 weeks." "And Mr. Clutterbuck's view of him?" The vicar hesitated, and coughed. "It was," Dr. Fell noted with interest. The same small apologetic cough as before, occurring now at exactly the moment a direct answer was required. A cough, one might almost say, with a vocation. Ambrose was fond of the boy, I think, in his way. He did not, however, altogether approve of him. A common domestic arrangement. Quite. Dr. Fell rose, with the slow grandeur of a hot air balloon preparing for flight, and took up his canes. At the study door he paused, as though a small matter had only just occurred to him. "Vicar, forgive me the handkerchief." "Doctor, you have coughed, by my reckoning, 9 times since we entered. Always into the handkerchief, always the same corner of it. You are, I cannot help observing, at some pains not to use the other." He smiled, with great mildness. "I ask only because I had a curate once who did the same, and it turned out, poor fellow, to be because he had cut himself shaving and did not wish his wife to know he had used her best linen. Nothing sinister, merely curious." The vicar looked at him for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he turned the handkerchief over. A small, rusty smudge, no larger than a sixpence, stained one corner. "I grazed my hand," said the Reverend Melinda quietly, "upon the vestry door this morning. A splinter. It bled a little. I did not think it worth remarking." "Ah," said Dr. Fell. "No, one never does." And he wished the vicar good afternoon, and took his leave, and said nothing at all until they were halfway across the green, when he remarked, to no one in particular, that it was extraordinary how often splinters in country vestries drew blood, precisely where a man had been struck above the left ear. As they came within sight of the library again, Inspector Morley gave Dr. Fell a look compounded equally of professional patience and private alarm. "You cannot mean," he said, that the vicar struck him. "My dear fellow, I can mean half a dozen things before tea," said Dr. Fell. "The difficulty is to decide which of them will still bear inspection afterwards." He paused at the library gate to recover his breath, to admire the rain on the holly hedge, and perhaps to let the remark settle. A man may lie from guilt, from fear, from vanity, or from the simple reluctance to appear ridiculous. The last motive is far commoner in villages than murder. Inside, the room had lost none of its obstinate air. Constable Pinfold was stationed by the desk, with the expression of a footman guarding a dowager's pearls. On the blotter lay a number of loose papers, already arranged in an order that suggested the constable had not arranged them himself. Morley explained that the police surgeon had now fixed the time of death more narrowly, somewhere between 9:15 and 9:30. No signs of poison had been found in the coffee. The wound, though not deep, had been sufficient. Death, the surgeon said, would have followed quickly, if not instantly. "So our victim rose from his chair after Mrs. Halloway brought the tray," said Dr. Fell, "and before Miss Trout left her window to baste whatever it is she bastes on Tuesdays. He sat down with surprising suddenness at the desk, spread the papers with a large, careful hand, and began to read in silence. There were bills, circulars, a letter from the diocesan office, and a sheaf of notes in Mr. Clutterbuck's tidy, narrow script. Most concerned the cataloguing of books from the old family collection, each item numbered, dated where possible, and annotated in the margin with brisk remarks whose dryness had plainly been hereditary. One volume of sermons was marked "worm-eaten but pious." Another, a folio history of monastic rents, unreadable except by bishops and possibly criminals. Dr. Fell's eyebrows rose. "I warm to him more and more," he said. Then he stopped over a single folded sheet, reopened it, and read it twice. Morley, watching, observed that all the agreeable disorder seemed to go out of him. He did not become dramatic. He merely became attentive, which in Dr. Fell amounted to the same thing. "What is it?" asked the inspector. "A note copied from one of the colonel's papers, or perhaps from a book tucked among them. Listen. The key remains where the first borrower left it, under witness of all who cannot read. Charming. And underneath, In Clutterbuck's hand, 3 words: "Ask Vane about this." He passed the sheet across. "Who is Miss Vane?" Beyond the description already supplied by the vicar. Morley said that Miss Esther Vane lived in Ely, lectured occasionally on church architecture, and had for some years been allowed to rummage through the Clutterbuck shelves in pursuit of bindings, inscriptions, and other dusty excitements. She was expected in the village that afternoon, though the rain might postpone her. At this, Pinfold coughed, in a manner less peculiar than the vicar's but more informative. A caller had already arrived, he said, and was waiting in the hall because Mrs. Halloway had declared the kitchen unsuitable for gentlemen who wore scent. The caller was young Mr. Dennis Clutterbuck. He had come from London upon hearing the news, and had asked twice whether his uncle had left a will, and once whether the library must remain shut very long. Dennis Clutterbuck was in the hall, dripping elegantly on the flags. He was 30 or thereabout, dark, handsome in a thin and rather expensive manner, and dressed with the polished care of a man whose bills had recently begun to alarm him. He greeted Morley with the composure of one who had already practiced bereavement on the train. Dr. Fell, introduced, bowed from the shoulders. "My poor uncle," said Dennis. "This is beyond anything. I came as soon as I could. I suppose there must be formalities." "There always are," said Morley. "Did you see your uncle yesterday?" "No. Sunday, briefly. He was out of temper. One hardly knew why." "Over money?" asked Dr. Fell. Dennis smiled without pleasure. "In this family, Doctor, one is always presumed to mean money. Sometimes one merely means furniture." The answer was odd enough to arrest even Morley. Dennis explained, with a shrug which had once been charming and was now nearly tired, that Ambrose had lately accused him of trying to remove certain books from the house. The charge was absurd. He had borrowed a chair from the morning room for the garden and failed to put it back. That was all. His uncle had become singularly sharp on the subject of objects changing place. Books, keys, papers, even umbrellas had acquired for him an alarming moral significance. He said things had been interfered with, Dennis said, not stolen, disturbed, as if the house were answering him back. Dr. Fell looked down at the note in his hand. "Did he mention a key?" "Only in the most general family sense," said Dennis. "That is to say," with resentment. Before Morley could pursue that branch of inheritance, Mrs. Halloway appeared at the library door and announced that a lady had come from Ely in a motor soaked to the axle, that she insisted on seeing Mr. Clutterbuck's papers at once, and that she was not, in Mrs. Halloway's judgment, a person who liked being refused. Dr. Fell pocketed the copied note, regarded Dennis with almost fatherly serenity, and said, "Excellent. Let us hear what Miss Vane can read where others witness." Miss Esther Vane was a narrow woman of perhaps 45, dressed in a mackintosh of military cut, carrying a leather satchel that had plainly outlived 2 monarchs, and disinclined to shake hands with people she did not know. She stood in the hall and regarded the 3 gentlemen present as though each had been misfiled. "I was to see Mr. Clutterbuck at 4, she said, without preliminary. "I am, as you observe, precisely upon the hour. Am I to understand that he is dead?" "You are, madam," said Morley. "Ah," said Miss Vane. She removed her mackintosh, hung it upon the stand, and shook the rain from her hat into a potted fern. "Then I am too late." Dr. Fell, who had met the phrase in several contexts during his career, looked at her with heightened interest. "Too late for what, Miss Vane?" "To prevent him making a fool of himself, Doctor." He was preparing to announce something he could not substantiate. "I had written to dissuade him. I had driven here to dissuade him in person. Now he is beyond dissuasion, which is a pity, though doubtless a relief to him." She spoke without cruelty, rather with the level exactness of a woman who catalogued for a living and saw no reason to decorate the facts. "May I see the library?" Morley hesitated, but Dr. Fell inclined his head, and she was admitted. She did not look at the chalk outline. She went straight to the desk, studied the arrangement of the papers for perhaps 10 seconds, and said, "The Trevelyan volume is not here." "The what?" asked Morley. "A small quarto bound in calf, title in gilt, spine cracked, dated 1823. It should be third from the left, on the second shelf, from the floor, behind you." "It is not." She turned, ran a finger along the shelf, indicated, paused, and added, "Nor has it been for at least a week. The dust is unbroken." "Someone removed it and did not replace it." "And its significance?" asked Dr. Fell, who was now positively radiant. "It contained a loose sheet, of which Ambrose had become unreasonably fond. The sheet purported to identify a hiding place for certain Clutterbuck family documents removed from the house during what he called, with characteristic pomp, the unpleasantness of 1944. I regarded the sheet as a forgery. He did not. We disagreed, as scholars are permitted to do, with vigor. She closed the satchel she had not yet opened. If he intended to open the hiding place and exhibit the contents, he would first have required the book. The book is gone. Therefore, either he has already opened it, or someone wished him not to. It was at this point that Mrs. Halloway, who had been hovering at the library door with a tray of tea nobody had asked for, set the tray down upon the hall table with more noise than the china deserved, and said, in a clear voice, "Well, I can't find my umbrella." Everyone turned. She looked back at them with an expression of irritated innocence. "I had it this morning. I had it on my arm when I came up the path. I set it behind the door, same as always. It isn't there now." "The door of the library?" asked Dr. Fell. "The door of the library, sir. And before you ask, no, I didn't take it to the kitchen, because I never do, because it drips." A small silence followed, of the kind that occurs when an apparently domestic complaint reveals itself to be of possible forensic weight. Dr. Fell turned his bulk toward the library door and contemplated the space immediately behind it, the space, that is, in which Mr. Clutterbuck had lain. Morley was already there, casting about. No umbrella. No trace of where one might have stood. "Mrs. Halloway," said Dr. Fell, with grave gentleness, "when, exactly, did you last have sight of it?" "When I opened the door with my key, sir. I leaned it against the doorpost before I pushed. Then I saw the master, and I forgot everything in this world except the telephone. And when you came back into the hall later, I never looked. Why should I?" Dennis, lounging against the newel post in the manner of a man who did not like being ignored, said lightly, "Perhaps a constable has taken it as evidence." Pinfold, stung, replied that he had not, and that nothing had been taken out of the building that had not been listed. Morley confirmed it. The umbrella, then, had vanished between the moment Mrs. Halloway had rested it against the doorpost and some later moment nobody had observed. Miss Vane, watching this exchange with the detachment of a woman observing an unfamiliar ceremony, remarked only that a heavy country umbrella could conceal a great number of things, and had done so in at least 2 novels she could name. Dr. Fell did not reply to her at once. He was looking, instead, at the coat stand in the hall, where 4 pegs carried their usual burdens, a gardening jacket of the late Mr. Clutterbuck's, a scarf, a felt hat, and, on the lowest peg, a single leather glove. A single glove. He took it down with 2 fingers. The leather was damp, not wet, as it would have been had it been out in the afternoon's rain, but faintly, evenly damp, as though worn for a few moments in a fine drizzle and then laid aside to dry. "Whose is this?" he asked. Mrs. Halloway blinked at it. "The master's, sir. He has a pair." "The other?" She looked about. She looked on the stand. She looked in the drawer beneath it. "It was here this morning, sir. They were both here." "Ah," said Dr. Fell, and laid the single glove very gently back upon its peg, as one returns a card to an opponent one has not yet decided to trust. Miss Vane departed shortly afterwards, promising to return the following morning with her notes on the missing quarto and requesting, with austere courtesy, that nothing further be moved. Dennis announced that he would put up at the George and Dragon, as the house felt, he said, oppressive. Mrs. Halloway declared that she would look for her umbrella in the morning when her temper had improved, and Dr. Fell, left alone for a moment with Morley in the darkening hall, observed, almost to himself, that it was a curious household in which a book, an umbrella, and a glove had all elected to go missing on the same day, and that of the three, he was by some way the most interested in the glove. The next morning broke with that pale, undecided light which suggests that the sun has risen only from a sense of duty. Little Pafley, washed by the night's rain, looked outwardly improved and inwardly attentive. News had travelled, as news does in villages, by routes no map records. By 8 o'clock, Miss Trout had already told the butcher's wife that murder was one thing but carelessness with umbrellas another, while at the George and Dragon Dennis Clutterbuck was taking coffee in public and grief in private, which was the cheaper arrangement. Dr. Fell, who had slept badly and eaten excellently, returned to the library a little after 9 with Inspector Morley and the settled air of a man about to be contradicted by objects. They had scarcely entered the hall when Mrs. Halloway, armed with a dusting cloth and an expression of firm disapproval, announced that the missing umbrella had not returned in the night, the second glove had not returned either, and someone had left mud on the scullery flags in a shape she considered intentional. This last detail, dragged out with effort, proved useless. The mud was Mrs. Halloway's own. The umbrella, however, remained obstinately absent. So did the little quarto Miss Vane had named. The glove, Dr. Fell observed, was now dry. He lifted it again from the peg, sniffed it, and asked whether Mr. Clutterbuck ever gardened in leather. Mrs. Halloway said certainly not. He disapproved of soil except as an historical condition. Before Morley could ask what kind of history might be written with a glove, Constable Pinfold came in from the rear garden with a face of unusual purpose. A ladder had been found, he said. Not an ordinary step-ladder from the pantry, or a gentleman's folding contrivance from a boot cupboard, but a long ash ladder of the sort used for gutters, windows, apples, and persons with more confidence than balance. It was lying on the wet grass beyond the library wall, half concealed behind the yew hedge, and no one in the household claimed it. Dr. Fell turned so quickly that one of his canes clicked on the flags. "Take me to it," he said. The ladder belonged, after 10 minutes of village consultation, to the church. That is to say, it belonged officially to the parish, practically to the sexton, and morally to anyone who could get to the shed before the sexton noticed. It had been borrowed, nobody knew when, from the lean-to behind the vestry. The Reverend Mallender, fetched from his study, confirmed this with an appearance of fatigue rather than surprise. He had not used it himself for weeks. The rain had darkened the rungs. One side stile carried a faint smear of reddish clay. Dr. Fell bent over it, breathing like a discreet bellows, and asked whether there was reddish clay in the churchyard. There was not. There was, however, a strip of it by the kitchen garden at the George and Dragon. This produced, as perhaps it was intended to produce, an immediate glance toward Dennis Clutterbuck, who had wandered out from the inn-yard in a raincoat too fine for utility and found himself, without intending it, the centre of rustic attention. He denied any knowledge of the ladder with the easy irritation of a man accustomed to denying tradesmen. He had gone no nearer the kitchen garden than the breakfast-room. The clay on his shoes, if any, would no doubt prove metropolitan. Besides, he added, looking at the library windows, what use is a ladder there, unless one of you proposes to climb through solid iron? No one answered. The question had the inconvenient merit of being sensible. Miss Trout supplied the next complication before anyone could dismiss the first. She approached from across the green, carrying a market basket, and that composure which in elderly spinsters often precedes attack. Yes, she said, she had seen a ladder yesterday morning. At 9:30, or thereabouts, it was lying flat upon the grass by the library wall. No, she had not mentioned it. because ladders were not crimes, and because in this village if one began reporting every object out of place, one should never get any knitting done. But yes, shortly before 10, she had seen someone move it. "A man?" asked Morley. "Certainly a person," said Miss Trout. "Under an umbrella." This, she added, was why she had not identified the figure. The umbrella had been large, dark, and lowered with an air of determination. Mrs. Halloway sat down abruptly on the stone bench by the path. "My umbrella," she said, with the dazed outrage of a woman whose property has entered public life. "Then somebody took my umbrella and my mourning, both. Dr. Fell asked Miss Trout whether the person under it had seemed tall or short. Miss Trout replied that the person had seemed wet. Pinfold, sent at once to the church shed, returned with the information that the ladder had been taken before breakfast and the shed door left open. The sexton blamed boys. The boys, assembled and questioned, blamed weather. Meanwhile, Dr. Fell walked the length of the ladder, counted the rungs, and finally laid his hand against the library wall beneath the middle window. There, just above shoulder height, was a small, fresh scrape on the stone, invisible unless one stooped and looked along it sidewise. He said nothing until Morley became uneasy. Then quietly, he asked for the ladder to be raised against the wall, not to the window, but 3 feet short of it. Pinfold obeyed. The top rested exactly where the scrape showed. Dr. Fell nodded. "There is your logical mistake, Inspector," he said. "Everybody sees a ladder and thinks of climbing, but ladders serve humbler purposes. They let a man reach and use both hands above ground level." He turned to Mrs. Halloway. "When you leaned your umbrella by the library door, did it still have its ferrule cap?" She stared. "The tip? No, sir. That came off months ago." That Dr. Fell's remark about ferrule caps was allowed to hang unanswered in the wet air was not because anyone had failed to hear it, but because nobody was yet prepared to be the first to admit they had understood. Inspector Morley pocketed his notebook with the air of a man preserving a statement for later use, dismissed Pinfold to interview the sexton a second time, and proposed, since it was nearly 12 and the rain was considering a second performance, that they retire indoors for half an hour's reflection. The obvious indoors was the morning room of the old library, where Mr. Clutterbuck was no longer lying, the sheet having been taken away shortly after dawn. Mrs. Halloway, grateful to have a task that did not involve umbrellas, produced sherry. The decanter was Waterford, the glasses were not, and the sherry itself was of that pale, respectable kind which country gentlemen keep for visitors they are not sure they wish to encourage. Dr. Fell accepted a glass with pleasure, examined it against the light, and remarked that one could always tell the character of a household by what it offered at an unsuitable hour. Morley drank his quickly, being on duty, and Dennis Clutterbuck, who had been permitted to sit in because no one could think of a civil reason to exclude him, drank his slowly because he was listening. Miss Vane, arriving at the very moment the decanter was stoppered, declined sherry on principle and accepted a chair on sufferance. She had brought, she announced, her notes upon the missing quarto. She spread them upon the little round table with the deliberate economy of a woman who disliked waste of gesture, and proceeded to read aloud from them in a voice which admitted of no interruption. The Trevelyan volume, she said, had entered the Clutterbuck collection in 1897 as part of a bequest from a maternal cousin. Pasted inside the front board was a bookplate, tucked behind the bookplate, and visible only when the board was flexed, was the loose sheet which had so enchanted Ambrose, and which she herself regarded as a fabrication of no earlier than 1920. The sheet named, in cipher of a rudimentary kind, a place in the house where certain documents had been concealed during the war. Ambrose had believed the documents to consist of family correspondence. She herself had believed them to consist of nothing whatever. "And yet," observed Dr. Fell mildly, "somebody has thought them worth a murder. Somebody," said Miss Vane, "has thought something worth a murder. It does not follow that the somebody and the something were correctly matched." She fixed him with a pale, deliberate eye. "Men kill oftener for what they imagine than for what exists, Doctor. You will have noticed." Dr. Fell inclined his head, as to a colleague. It was at this juncture that the disagreement broke out, and it did so by the oblique route that disagreements in polite rooms generally take. Dennis, setting down his glass, observed that if the documents did exist, and if they had been successfully concealed in 1944, they would now form part of his uncle's estate, and therefore, in due course, of his own. Miss Vane replied that the ownership of papers depended upon their content, not their position, and that she would be interested to hear upon what authority he proposed to inherit Clutterbuck family secrets he had not yet read. Dennis answered that blood was an authority older than paper. Miss Vane answered that blood, in her experience, was more usually spilt by paper than the reverse. Morley, alarmed at the direction the conversation was taking, suggested more sherry. Dr. Fell, who had closed his eyes in apparent contentment, did not move. What emerged through this skirmish was a pattern none of them had articulated before. Ambrose Clutterbuck, during the last 6 weeks, had spoken to 3 people about the cataloguing of his uncle's papers, to Miss Vane, by letter and in person, to the Reverend Melinda, at the vicarage, over port, and to Denny's, at intervals, whenever Denny's financial horizons had grown overcast. Each had been told a slightly different version of what he hoped to find. Miss Vane had been told of correspondence. The vicar had been told of a sum of money. Dennis had been told of nothing definite at all, which he had naturally interpreted as a promise of something substantial. Dr. Fell opened his eyes at this point and remarked, to no one in particular, that a man who tells 3 stories about the same cupboard has either forgotten what is in it or knows precisely and intends to see who comes for it first. The Reverend Melinda, arriving at that moment with apologies for his lateness and a fresh handkerchief, was drawn into the conversation before he had quite removed his coat. Asked directly whether Ambrose had mentioned a sum of money, he coughed, looked at his hands, and admitted he had. Ambrose had spoken of restitution of old debts, of an obligation, perhaps to the parish, perhaps to a private party, which he intended to discharge once he had laid hands upon certain papers of his uncle's. The vicar had taken this, charitably, to mean a bequest. Dennis, listening, grew pale beneath his well-brushed exterior. "And he did not," said Dennis, "see fit to mention any of this to me." "He did not, I imagine," murmured Dr. Fell, "wish to disappoint you prematurely." The disagreement, such as it was, ended not in resolution, but in the small arithmetic of departures. Miss Vane gathered her notes, promised her telephone number to the inspector, and left for Ely by the 1:30 train. Dennis went up to his room at the George, taking with him a bottle of sherry. No one begrudged him. The vicar, at Dr. Fell's pleasant request, stayed behind. When the room had emptied to the 3 of them, Dr. Fell set down his empty glass with great care and said, "Vicar, yesterday you grazed your hand on the vestry door. Today you arrive in a fresh handkerchief. I should like, if I may, to see the hand." The vicar held it out without protest. It was unbandaged, unmarked, and entirely clean. "The graze," he said quietly, "healed in the night. I am fortunate in my constitution." "You are fortunate," said Dr. Fell, "in a number of particulars. Let us see whether the fortune extends to the vestry door." The vestry door, when they reached it, proved disappointingly innocent. It was old oak, scuffed by cassocks and hymn books, with a brass latch polished by generations of anxious fingers, but there was no splinter upon it large enough to draw blood from anything less robust than a plum. Dr. Fell examined the edge, the panels, and the frame with stubborn care, while the Reverend Melinda stood by in an attitude of clerical resignation. At length the doctor straightened, breathing heavily. "Either your door heals even faster than your hand, vicar," he said, or neither of them was ever much wounded. Melinda smiled, but it was the smile of a man accepting a bill he could not dispute. Inspector Morley said nothing. He had begun to distrust the vicar's small evasions without yet knowing whether they concealed murder, embarrassment, or merely a tiresome habit. The church smelled of wet stone and extinguished candles. Somewhere at the far end, Mrs. Pring was arranging flowers with the severity of a military operation, and her presence, though distant, seemed enough to restrain everybody from open accusation. Dr. Fell asked, almost idly, whether the church kept an umbrella stand. The question was answered by Mrs. Betteridge, who had entered behind them unheard and was carrying a tray of parish circulars as though they were evidence against mankind. Yes, the vicarage had one in the back hall, she said. The church had none, because umbrellas left in churches multiplied during rain and vanished in sunshine. Her employer gave a brief cough, which sounded less like illness than a reminder. Mrs. Betteridge looked at him, then at Dr. Fell, and became exact. No unfamiliar umbrella had come into her keeping that morning. It was not what she said that interested Dr. Fell so much as the manner in which she had nearly said something else. When she withdrew, he watched her go with narrowed eyes. Melinda, perceiving this, became unexpectedly genial and suggested luncheon at the vicarage. There were cold slices of ham, a tart of doubtful origin, and coffee strong enough to encourage honesty in weaker souls. The doctor ate with concentration. Morley, who knew that this was one of the signs of mental activity, waited. The vicar spoke of diocesan finances. Nobody listened. Mrs. Betteridge came in twice to clear plates. On the first occasion, she glanced at the vicar's sleeve, as if checking whether it was still dry. On the second, she set down the coffee pot with unnecessary force and said, into the middle of no conversation at all, "There is no sense in gentlemen borrowing things and never returning them." Melinda looked up sharply. "My good woman, I refer to the parish secateurs, sir," she replied. The correction was instant, but it did not quite ring true. Dr. Fell thanked her for the coffee as though she had done him a personal kindness. She coloured, which was not in her nature. After luncheon, the vicar was called away to settle some dispute about the Mothers' Union raffle. He left with visible relief. Dr. Fell remained by the dining-room fire until the front door had closed, then rose at once and followed the sound of crockery to the kitchen. Mrs. Betteridge was there alone, rinsing cups with the expression of a woman washing arguments out of china. She did not start when he entered. "You wish to tell me something, madam?" he said. "No, doctor." "Then you very nearly achieved it by accident." She dried her hands. "If I speak, there will be talk." "There is already murder," said Dr. Fell. She considered this, not as a dramatic statement, but as a practical one. At last, she admitted that at a little after 9 on Tuesday morning, she had looked from the back scullery window and seen the vicar crossing the garden from the direction of the green. He was bareheaded. He had no cough. He went in by the side door and came out again 5 minutes later with his hat on and his handkerchief already in his hand. "And was he carrying anything?" asked Morley, who had joined them unheard. Mrs. Betteridge hesitated. "That is what I nearly said. I could not be sure. It might have been only his rolled sermon." "Only," said Dr. Fell gently. "You do not believe it was." Mrs. Betteridge twisted the tea towel once and let it fall. She believed, she said, that it had been long and dark and awkward to hold under the arm. She had thought at first of a walking stick, but the vicar had no such stick, and besides, when he returned to the dining-room later for breakfast, there had been a wet mark on the passage tiles near the umbrella stand. She had wiped it away before anyone could tread it about. No, she had not mentioned it. People in villages were expected to keep houses running, not inquiries. Dr. Fell thanked her gravely and went at once to the back hall. The stand itself was empty save for a rector's umbrella with a carved duck handle and a child's forgotten parasol left from summer. He touched the wall behind them, then the mat below. Both were dry. You see, "Morley," he said, "something visited this house only briefly, and whatever it was, it arrived wet." They walked back across the green in a silence that had more than one author. The rain, which had come and gone, with the caprice of an indecisive visitor, was now content to drip from eaves and hedges without further commitment. Inspector Morley carried the considerable weight of Mrs. Betteridge's evidence. Dr. Fell carried his own, and 2 canes besides. Halfway across, he paused to rest, not because he needed to, but because he wished to think without the distraction of motion. "Morley," he said, "let us for a moment take the vicar at his worst. He comes from the green at 9. He carries something long and damp under his arm. He returns 5 minutes later with only his sermon and a cough. It is a suggestive itinerary. It is also impossible." "Impossible, sir?" "Impossible, Inspector, for when he crosses that garden, Mrs. Halloway is already hammering at a locked library door. By every account, the door was locked from within at that hour. The vicar can have taken nothing out of a room he had not entered." They resumed their walk. At the library gate, Constable Pinfold was waiting with the air of a man bringing news he was not certain was welcome. He had been, he said, measuring windows. Dr. Fell beamed at him as at a favourite pupil. Pinfold, encouraged, reported that each of the 3 library windows was fitted within its embrasure in the manner customary to the period, a lower sash which rose, an upper which did not. The grilles outside were flush to the stone, and their bars set close enough to exclude even a determined child. He had tested each sash. 2 of them rose easily and had plainly been used. The third, the centre one, refused to rise at all. It had been, upon close inspection, nailed at some distant date and painted over several times until it had ceased to count as a window in the working sense. "Nailed shut," said Dr. Fell. "Since when, would you say, Constable?" Pinfold, who had asked Mrs. Halloway this very question, replied that she could not remember the window ever being opened. It had been in that condition when she came in 1945. The late Mr. Clutterbuck's father had nailed it, she believed, after a draught. Pinfold had tried the nails with a penknife. They were rusted into the wood past the reach of any recent interference. Dr. Fell considered this for a long moment, and then, to Morley's surprise, smiled. "Admirable," he said. "That is precisely the window we want." They returned into the library. The room, visited now for the 3rd time in as many days, was beginning to take on that air of weary familiarity which attends the scene of a crime when the crime will not yield. The chalk outline had faded a little. The desk was as it had been. Dr. Fell ignored both and went at once to the centre window. He tapped the lower sash. It did not move. He tapped the upper. It did not move. He ran his palm along the sill, then along the architrave, then along the inner shutter, which folded back against the wall in the old manner. The shutters were deep, panelled, and had not been closed, by the look of their hinges, for many years. He folded one out nonetheless, and examined the back of it with keen attention. On the inner face of the left shutter, low down, almost at the floor, a small section of wood had been lately disturbed. It was not a panel, but an inset, cut and refitted so neatly that the paint covered every seam. Dr. Fell took out a penknife, not his own, but one borrowed from Pinfold, with the ceremony of accepting a relic, and worked the blade along the join. The inset lifted. Behind it lay a shallow cavity, perhaps 6 inches by 4, and in the cavity lay nothing whatever except a faint rectangle of dust from which something rectangular had lately been removed. He sat back on his heels, which was an operation of some magnitude, and contemplated the emptiness with an expression of keen, professional appreciation. "There, Morley," he said, "is the hiding place Ambrose Clutterbuck believed in. And there, also, is why his belief cost him his life. It was not in the chimney. It was not under a floorboard. It was in a window that had not opened in 80 years, behind a shutter no one folded." Miss Vane, who thought the sheet a forgery, was wrong in her conclusion. and her lectured error may have been the safest thing about her. Somebody else, you see, took the sheet at face value, read it correctly, and helped himself while the owner of the house sat reading Trollope 8 feet away. And then returned, said Morley slowly, to kill him. Perhaps, said Dr. Fell. Or perhaps he did not need to return. Perhaps Ambrose rose from his desk because he heard a noise he could not explain at a window that should not have made one. Perhaps he walked toward it, and at the door, on his way to the shutter, somebody was waiting who should not have been in the room at all. We have been assuming, Morley, that the question is how our murderer got in. The better question is how long he had been there. Morley stared at him. You mean, I mean that in an impossible room, one must begin by doubting the meaning of the word impossible. The door was locked. The windows were barred. Granted. But when did the locking occur? And who locked whom in with what? A key in a dead man's pocket proves only that the key was upon him when he died. It does not prove that he turned it himself. Dr. Fell replaced the inset, closed the shutter, and rose, with the assistance of both canes, and a good deal of the room. Let us find out, he said. Which of our 3 stories was told by the right person to the wrong audience? I think we shall not have to look very far for our missing umbrella. Dr. Fell left the library with the air of a man who had found the right question. Inspector Morley, who had learned that such moods were useful, accompanied him not to the George and Dragon, but to the office of Mr. Septimus Pring, solicitor, churchwarden, and guardian of little Pafley's anxieties. The office stood beside the post office and smelled of sealing wax, damp ledgers, and legal caution. Mr. Pring himself was a narrow gentleman in spectacles, with the complexion of an elderly candle. He received them standing, because solicitors believed chairs encouraged disclosure. Yes, he had acted for Ambrose for years. Yes, he had seen him Monday evening. Yes, the interview had concerned a will. No, he was not at liberty to disclose its contents. At this, Dr. Fell sighed so sadly that even Mr. Pring appeared moved. My dear sir, said the doctor, lowering himself into the prohibited chair without invitation, when a gentleman is murdered in a locked room, secrecy becomes less a principle than a luxury. You may preserve it, naturally, and I shall admire your honor while the wrong person escapes justice, but I confess the effect will be chilly. Mr. Pring blinked, sat down in self-defense, and yielded. Ambrose had indeed instructed him to prepare a codicil. The existing will left the house and residue of the estate to Dennis Clutterbuck. The codicil would have altered this materially. Dennis was not to inherit the library or the collection. These were to pass into a charitable trust, overseen by the diocese, and, to Mr. Pring's horror, catalogued with Miss Vane's assistance. A further sum was to be set aside for what Ambrose had called an old obligation. He had promised to name the beneficiary after examining certain papers on Tuesday morning. Did he say what papers? Asked Morley. Only that they concerned his Uncle Edgar, the war years, and a mistake which had gone on too long. He was uncharacteristically excited. I thought him imprudent. Mr. Pring paused. He also asked whether a man might make restitution without causing public scandal. I replied that scandal attended the attempt more faithfully than the offence. Dr. Fell nodded. And did anyone know of this change? Not from me. But Mr. Clutterbuck hinted that his nephew would be disappointed, that the vicar would be embarrassed, and that Miss Vane would be angry for scholarly reasons. I took this for one of those intellectual jokes bachelors permit themselves when they have no wife to silence them. They left Mr. Pring and crossed to the George and Dragon in time for luncheon. The dining room was nearly full. Little Pafley had discovered an appetite for cold beef and indirect observation. Dennis Clutterbuck was at a corner table, writing letters with an energy that suggested creditors. The Reverend Mallender, who had evidently chosen the inn to avoid his own kitchen, was being served steak and kidney pudding. Miss Trout, beneath the mirror, was consuming blancmange while preserving a view of both exits. Dr. Fell ordered shepherd's pie. When the plate came, he ate steadily, watching everything. Morley, who had ceased to regard this as eccentric, confined himself to questions. If Denny had known of the codicil, his motive was obvious. If the vicar had known of the restitution, his embarrassment might be obvious. If Miss Vane had known the collection would become a trust, annoyance could hardly extend to murder. Dr. Fell agreed with each proposition and appeared satisfied by none. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Halloway entered by the side door carrying a basket, and the expression of a woman kept from useful labor by other people's wickedness. She had come, she announced, to collect dripping tins from the kitchen and to inform Inspector Morley that she had remembered something. On Tuesday morning, after telephoning the police, she had not remained in the hall continuously as she had first supposed. She had gone upstairs for half a minute to fetch smelling salts from the linen cupboard because it had occurred to her that she might faint later and preferred to be prepared. During that half minute, the front hall had been empty. The room seemed to contract around the statement. Dennis stopped writing. The vicar laid down his fork. Miss Trout ceased to blink. Morley got her quietly into the passage and took the rest there, while Dr. Fell remained with his untouched second helping, which the waitress had just set before him. Mrs. Halloway, flustered now that memory had become important, insisted that the interval was brief, no longer than it took to open the cupboard and be disappointed by it. The smelling salts were not there after all. But yes, in that interval, anyone already in the house might have passed through the hall unseen. No, the library door had not been in her sight every second. Yes, her umbrella had been leaning by the stand. No, she had not noticed the glove then. And yes, when she came down, she had the distinct impression that something in the house had altered. Dr. Fell, who had joined them by then, looked not at her, but through the passage window toward the inn yard, where the strip of reddish clay by the kitchen garden showed between paving stones. Then he looked back into the dining room. The waitress was removing his second helping, untouched. Dennis had risen and was speaking to the landlord with too much ease. The vicar was staring into the remains of his pudding. "Morley," said Dr. Fell softly, "our murderer did not need to vanish from the library at once. He needed only to cross an empty hall, carrying something that could pass for an umbrella, and to know exactly when the hall would be empty. That is domestic knowledge, not criminal genius. Ask the landlord to keep Dennis here. Then ask the vicar, Miss Vane, Mr. Pring, Mrs. Betteridge, and Mrs. Halloway to come to the library at 6. I believe," he added, eyeing the abandoned pie with regret, "that I must decline a second helping for the first time in 20 years. At 6 o'clock the old library had the uneasy air of a drawing-room in which somebody intends to mention money. Mrs. Halloway stood by the mantel, in her best black. Miss Vane sat beside the desk. Mr. Pring had selected a chair from which he could object on principle. The Reverend Melinda lingered near the door, and Dennis Clutterbuck leaned against the shelves with that dangerous ease which suggested an exit already measured. Inspector Morley remained by the hearth. Dr. Fell, installed in the largest chair, regarded them all with melancholy good humor. No one, however, looked remotely comfortable in it. "Let us begin," he said, "by rescuing the innocent from their own inventions. Vicar, you did not kill Mr. Clutterbuck. You merely found Mrs. Halloway's umbrella afterwards, carried it home, hid it, and lied because you discovered inside it papers which embarrassed you." Melinda closed his eyes. It was not denial, but relief. "Yes," he said. "I found it in the church porch. The papers had slid down the silk. I knew my father's handwriting and wanted time. Mrs. Halloway made a small sound of outrage at clerical interference with umbrellas. Dr. Fell nodded. "Quite. Your concealment came after the murder, not before it. The real business begins with the missing Trevelyan volume, the copied line about a key, and the old third key lost since 1957. Miss Vane was needed because she could interpret the clue. Dennis was dangerous because he listened when people thought him ornamental. The sentence was perfectly sensible. Under witness of all who cannot read referred to the Latin inscription over the library's side rainwater head. A pompous carving few villagers could translate. Colonel Edgar hid the old library key on the ledge beneath it. He leaned forward. To reach that ledge one needed height, which is why the church ladder came out early on Tuesday. The scrape on the wall marked where it rested. Mrs. Halloway's missing ferrule mattered because her umbrella tip could tease the key from the ledge without dropping it. Dennis borrowed the ladder, used the umbrella, took the key, returned both, and felt clever. He was only busy, Miss Vane said. Then he stole the quarto first and came here prepared. Exactly, said Doctor. 2 fell. You thought the sheet described a fraud. Ambrose thought it described a hiding place. Dennis thought it described profit. Only Ambrose was mostly right. Now for the impossible room. It was never impossible. We made it so by courtesy. Because the dead man was respectable, everyone assumed he had locked himself in. Yet a key in his waistcoat pocket proves only that he possessed one key. Dennis used the old key to enter early under the pretense of a family call. Ambrose admitted him, because murder is always easier where manners open the door. During that interview, Dennis discovered that Ambrose had already opened the shutter cavity and begun reading the papers. That is why the body lay near the door rather than the desk. The quarrel moved, Dennis said coolly. And the letter opener flew by itself, I suppose. Dr. Fell looked at him kindly. Nearly. It lay on the desk. Ambrose rose, either to dismiss you or to call Mrs. Halloway, and you seized the nearest object because frightened men choose convenience. You struck once. He fell quickly. You took the papers. Then you heard Mrs. Halloway at the door. You locked it from outside with the old key, crossed the hall while she went upstairs, and carried away the papers rolled inside her umbrella. In a village, a man with an umbrella is invisible unless he runs. You did not run. And the glove? Demanded Mrs. Halloway. Mr. Clutterbuck's glove, said Dr. Fell. Dennis snatched one from the stand to wrap the wet key after using it. He returned only one, because by then he had the umbrella under his arm and the papers inside it. That single damp glove proved somebody had paused in the hall and handled the pegs after the rain began. The vicar later found the umbrella in the church porch, opened it, recognized his father's writing, and hid both umbrella and truth. Clumsy, but not murderous. The rain beat against the barred windows. Dr. Fell spoke gently. The papers contained no money. Colonel Edgar took part of a fund for evacuee families and used it to settle a debt incurred by Dennis's father. Malinder Sr. knew and helped bury the matter. Ambrose discovered it only this month. He intended to restore the money through a trust, spare the parish scandal if he could, and cut Dennis out of the library because he no longer trusted him among objects that stayed where they were put. Dennis, you believed the papers concealed cash, and when Ambrose told you what he meant to do, you saw yourself disinherited and ridiculous. Dennis had listened with one hand over his mouth. When he lowered it, the self-possession had gone. He looked at the vicar. My father told me nothing, he said, only that the Clutterbucks had obligations. I thought he meant money. Everyone always means money. No, said Melinda, unexpectedly. In villages, we usually mean memory. It is less useful and harder to spend. Dennis gave a short laugh that ended badly. I did not mean to kill him. He said, I should have enough if I worked. He said it kindly. That was the worst of it. Inspector Morley moved then, not with triumph but reluctantly. Dennis did not resist. He took his coat. The vicar said he had given the papers to Mr. Pring an hour earlier. Miss Vane said the trust must proceed. Mrs. Halloway observed that if gentlemen would stop hiding things in umbrellas, the world would be easier to clean. Dr. Fell rose with effort and looked at the barred windows, the locked door, and the shelves. "There, Morley," he said. "You have your impossible murder explained. It was accomplished by an old key, a village timetable, and the fatal English belief that embarrassment is somehow worse than violence." Later, when Dennis had gone and the others had drifted away, Morley walked with Dr. Fell to the gate. Across the green, Miss Trout was drawing a curtain aside by precisely 2 inches. "You knew rather early, didn't you?" the inspector asked. Dr. Fell wheezed into the damp evening. "No," he said. "I knew only that somebody here cared more about appearances than facts. The rest was housekeeping." He settled his hat, looked back at the darkening library, and added, "A most respectable crime, Morley. I hope never to see another like it."